Hello, I'm David Tudor once more, and this is the seventh now in a series of short lectures on conflict, security, stability, and development. This time we're going to talk about the security sector itself. We're going to move from talking about concepts with all their vagueness and their questionable utility to talking about things, organizations, people, processes, and so forth. Now, you will remember that the very first lecture in this series was about security. It asked the question, what is security? And during that lecture, I pointed out that ideas of security are often very vague, not very helpful, and often difficult to make use of in any operational sense. It's unsurprising then that when we come to talk about the security sector, which is that sector which ought to provide this security, which is hard to define, the security sector itself turns out to be very hard to define. When I say hard to define, it would be more accurate, I think, to say hard to find a consensus definition of. I think I know what it is, and I'll tell you in a minute what I think it is. But there is huge controversy over what that sector is and how we understand it. There are two reasons primarily for this, and they both really relate to things that I said about the concept of security itself. Obviously, it's useful and interesting if you can define the security sector as something that you can have influence over and power in. And sometimes this may not be very obvious. If you're a human rights lawyer or an accountant, for example, it's not very obvious what wisdom you have to bring to the question of security. On the other hand, if you can define the security sector widely enough, then you can find yourself a home in it and you can give yourself influence and the prospect of power. So definitions of the security sector are highly political undertakings. The second problem is that people who study the security sector tend not to study anything else. Rather than coming to the security sector, for example, from the study of government, they begin from the security sector and work outwards, colonizing things as they go. My approach will be quite different. Rather than trying to assimilate other things and other organizations to the security sector, I'm going to begin from the other end and put the security sector in the context of the activities of government and the activities of a political system generally. Now, I said this is unhelpful, and perhaps I ought to just enlarge on that a little more. You will remember that one of the criticisms I made of human security as an all-inclusive definition of security, an all-inclusive concept, was that logically there was no end to what could be called security, and a concept that included everything, in the end, almost by definition, included nothing. Well, much the same is true of attempts to define the security sector very widely. We'll come to some particular examples in a minute, but fundamentally, if you think about it, if you include the security sector, if you include within the security sector a whole range of external and extraneous actors, in the end, there's nothing much except the security sector. In the end, for example, if you consider health to be part of human security, then logically doctors must be part of the security sector. And it's very hard to believe that a definition of like that is of any practical use, whatever. So I'm not going to take that approach. I'm going to start from a different definition of the security sector. Rather than working outwards and trying to colonize things, working inwards from what we know about the way that governments and political systems function. So I'm now putting on the screen the definition of the security sector that I'm going to use. And it says that the security sector consists of all those organizations whose primary purpose is the making or implementation of policy in the security area. That is a narrow definition, but it's what the security sector actually is. And I draw your attention to two words. One is organization. We're not simply concerned with uniformed forces here. We're concerned with the whole security sector organization. The other is primarily, because there are lots of organizations that have an interest in the security sector, or are affected by the security sector, or whose activities influence what the security sector does, but they're not part of it. Indeed, they are not and cannot be exclusively part of the security sector, because, as we'll see, they influence many other areas of government as well. Now, government in any country is divided into a number of different sectors. They typically include, for example, health, education, transport, and so forth. They're called sectors because in order to get things done, in order to make and implement policy, more than one organization, more than one ministry has to be involved. And I'll give you an example, not from the security sector, in a moment. There are implications in what one part of government does for nearly every other part of government. And that's why we talk in terms of sectors rather than just ministries or departments. Now, I said I'd give you an example. Let's talk about health. Okay. Now, the health sector is a sector of government like the security sector, and I'm going to divide its activities, and by extension and analogy those of the security sector in a moment, into three types. Now, the first type is the activity of organizations which are involved in the health sector. So with the health sector, you would have, obviously, a Ministry of Health. You would have hospitals. You would have doctors and nurses. You would have university research departments. You'd have research establishments, both public and private. And you would have, for example, training establishments for nurses and others, and lots of specialist institutions. Now, the common feature of all of these organizations and institutions is that they are primarily concerned with health. That is their primary function. Now, a second set of organizations could be described as associated with the health sector. Now, some are obvious. For example, education has to be able to provide trained personnel for the health sector. That's an associated activity. The Ministry of Finance exists in most countries to stop things being done and money being spent, and will require to be convinced that it's not better to let people die in the streets. So they'll be involved in all of the decisions. But there are other organizations as well. Local government is often a major player in health services. The courts are involved because there will be legislation concerning health, which they have to interpret. And of course, Parliament is involved as well. I say involved, associated in this kind of activity, because Parliament passes laws, agrees the health budget, debates health questions, and so on. So the whole series of organizations which are associated with health, but none of them deals with health exclusively, which is why I have called them associated organizations. And it would be obvious that the list I've just given pretty much could be applied to any sector of government, including the security sector. The finance ministry, after all, wants to stop everybody spending money, not just people in the health sector. Now, the third type of organisation or institution could be described as those who are interested in the health sector, but who don't have any legal or constitutional legitimacy. They're just interested. And obviously one can think of examples fairly easily. The media instantly come to mind looking for scandals and good stories. Individual parliamentarians looking to get their name in the media. Sorts of other organisations, lobby groups, for example, trade unions, employers' associations, drug companies, professional associations. All of these are organisations outside trying to influence what goes on the inside for fun or profit, or both. And you can, I'm sure, think of many others. But the key fact to repeat about those organisations is that they don't have any kind of legal legitimacy. They don't have any kind of official standing. Campaigning organisations, for example, may well campaign for improved health facilities in some area, but they have only the moral standing that public opinion grants them. They don't have any particular right to be heard. So that's a very quick sketch of the health sector, and you will see that that tripartite division that I've suggested to you between those who are involved, those who are associated, and those who are interested applies pretty much wherever you go in any part of government. Now, although I've named a lot of actors, obviously there are actors that I've left out, and there are actors whom I have excluded when I was talking about health from the health sector proper. One of the problems with very wide definitions is that you wind up with a list of actors as opposed to a description of the sector. I mentioned earlier that logically you could come up with a situation where doctors were part of the security sector, at which point the concept of the security sector, I think, would lose all meaning. But again, if you want to argue by analogy, as some people do, that we should take militias and organised criminal groups and so forth into account when we discuss the security sector, then just thinking back for a second, it would be logical to include drug smugglers in the health sector, which I think most people would regard as perverse. So if we're going to have a definition of the security sector that actually makes sense, we do need to be fairly rigid and fairly clear about what we mean. So if we distinguish between a sector of government and an area of activity in the economy and in political life, I think things become much easier. We can then move by analogy to discussing what the security sector is. Now, first of all, obviously, there are a number of organisations which are involved in the security sector. It's common to start with the military, the police, and then to talk about organisations responsible for their control and this kind of thing. Again, this is getting it the wrong way around. The security sector is a sector of government. Government exists to make and implement policy. So that's where we start. We start with the ministries. The two obvious ones are the Defence Ministry and the Interior Ministry. But there may also be other ministries directly involved. In some countries, there's a Ministry of Intelligence, or intelligence organisations are headed by individuals with ministerial status, and so forth. But first of all, we're talking about the organizations that exist to make policy and then to decide how to translate that policy into active terms. Now, that translation is done, obviously, by organizations, of which the most obvious are the military and the police and the intelligence services. But in some countries, we could add the gendarmerie, we could add the border guards, the coast guards, and possibly others. And in addition to that, there are plenty of organizations which do not deploy operationally, but which are part of the security sector. There are laboratories, research institutes, test and training organizations, all that kind of thing, all part of the security sector. And it's normal, because of the complexity of the security sector, for there to be some kind of coordinating body, in some cases a formal National Security Council, or in other cases part of the staff of the President's or Prime Minister's office, which is responsible for overall security questions as they affect the government and the country as a whole. So that, if you like, is a list of those involved in the security sector. And when we talk about the security sector, that's really what we mean. Now, the second category, I would begin with, if you like, a footnote or a clarification. In many countries, the foreign ministry is effectively so involved in security issues as to be part of the security sector. Foreign ministers are involved, obviously, in all aspects of what the security forces do, of security relationships with other countries, treaties, international conventions, negotiations, and so on. Depending on the country, at least part of the foreign ministry can be said to be involved in the security sector in the same way. But in any country, the foreign ministry is associated with the security sector in the way that I described above. The finance ministry, of course, will be trying to stop the defense ministry doing anything. But there are other parts of the political system as well. Local government will be deeply affected by what the security forces do. Many countries have police forces which are organised on a local basis, and national government has a relatively small role. And again, the courts will interpret legislation, will rule on legal questions, and in some countries on constitutional questions affecting the security sector. And last but by no means least, Parliament again has to approve the defence budget, will usually have approved laws relating to the security sector in its different guises, and will hold regular debates on security issues. So again, there's a set of organisations which are associated with the security sector. But just as they're not part of the health sector, so they're not part of the security sector. They're not part of any sector at all, really. And it's the failure of people to think in wider cross-governmental terms that leads to some of the confusions that I began by talking about. And then, of course, we have the list of organizations which would like to influence the security sector, and it's very various. It's probably longer than almost any other sector. The amount of money involved in security is enormous. The number of questions it deals with is enormous. So the media, individual politicians, NGOs, pressure groups, trade associations, trade unions, employers' organizations, professional organizations, human rights groups, just about everybody will be looking for a piece of the action or some funding or some publicity out of the security sector. But once again, these are organizations which take an interest in the security sector and try to use it for their own purposes. and try to achieve objectives of different types. But they are not, they're not organizations that have any legal or constitutional legitimacy. And that's an important distinction to remember. So, in other words, security policy and the security sector is similar to, but obviously not identical with, any other part of government. And that perhaps is the single thing to take away from this little talk. The security sector is not some strange and frightening beast which has no connection with anything else. We do not begin from the security sector and work outwards trying to colonize other areas. We situate the security sector in the activities of government and the political system more generally. Now, I've mentioned a series of organizations, ministries, operational forces, and so forth, which turn the policies of the security sector into actual practical activities. And in the next couple of lectures, I'll be talking about how that's done in practice and what these forces are like. In the meantime, thank you very much. Goodbye.